Hello learners. Welcome to the 58th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's Anglophone novel. I have almost finished my discussion of several novelists and most recently my discussion of Michelle Cliff's novel No Telephone to Heaven. I'll take a few minutes at the beginning of this lecture to wrap up, to round off the threads of some discussion which I began in the previous lecture, and then quickly move on to the next novelist in the series, which is A.S. Byatt, whose novel Possession I have chosen for discussion. I ended the previous lecture by talking a little bit about ruination, ruins and ruination. This signifies very powerfully the contradictions inherent in attempts to write both novels as well as novels that reflect and describe very truthfully the history of the Caribbean. It's important to reflect a little bit on the word ruin. There is a very powerful poem by the poet Derek Walcott, which is titled Ruins of a Great House. It's a very, very powerful poem. I have discussed it on multiple platforms, as have many other scholars. This poem is powerful because it stages a very crucial aesthetic and moral dilemma. It's the dilemma that a male Black poet from the Caribbean is faced with while he begins his career of writing poems in English, because he realizes that it's not a simple decision or choice of writing poems in the English language, but it also compels the poet to try and make sense of a very painful and disturbing set of emotions. The poet realizes that he both loves and hates this tradition. This is a tradition of poets who were actually also philanderers, murderers, robbers, writers who have very violently extracted resources from the land of his own, the poet's origin. So in England, the poet realizes that this house, which is in ruins, was built by English poets who maimed, stole, killed, murdered, did all kinds of violence to the place where he comes from, that is the Caribbean. And realizing this history produces in the poet not simply a mute, sort of a simple rage, but rather a very complicated set of emotions. On one hand, the poet is enraged, but on the other hand, he's also quite sympathetic because he realizes that this is the world of privilege, that this is the world that has been created by a legacy of violence. And the legacy of violence has created a world which now is not violent, but rather provides a great deal of pleasure, stability, comfort, wealth. And all of these things are now available for this poet. So Derek Walcott, writing on the cusp of success, on the cusp of recognition, realizes that he's entering this canon, he's entering a tradition of English poets, and he will soon be the beneficiary of the violence that was committed on his own land and his own people. This is a very profoundly disabling cognitive realization, and the poem does a great job of describing how this is both disabling but also the occasion for a great deal of sober reflections on the past as well as the future of Caribbean writing in English. Now, Simon Gikandi's book, Writing in Limbo, is written a little bit after Derek Walcott's poem. So Walcott gained success, became a part of the US, European, Anglophone canon. Simon Gikandi made sense of what was happening, what were the politics, what were the transactions, and what were the stakes in these choices that writers were making as they made their way from the Caribbean to the heart of the literary establishment in what was once the colonial center. So these were writers who were born in the peripheries of the empire and then who made their way through education, through labor, through physical emigration to the heart of the metropolis. So this very important journey came with costs, came with sometimes regrets, but also a great deal of success. So what are the parameters for studying this transition. Gikandi focuses on four writers and coins some very powerful terms. Among the most memorable and powerful terms that Gikandi coins is the term scholarship boy. Scholarship boy is a term that Gikandi uses first while studying the work of George Lamming. George Lamming wrote this very famous novel called The Castle of My Skin. And Gikandi's point is that this novel exemplifies what was a very common phenomenon, that of the scholarship boy. The male child, a young male child student from the Caribbean, enters the colonial, Anglophone, sometimes missionary system, school system, and succeeds in that system, works hard, secures a very high grade, and earns a scholarship to travel to England to finish his education. That is, gets a chance to study, to finish college in, say, Oxford or Cambridge. Now, this produces very peculiar sensibility. It produces what Gikandi calls a sort of alienation. That is because the scholarship boy remains in a state of limbo, distanced from his family, distanced from the culture in which he was born, the culture in which he was raised until he came of age and he left the island nation where he was born. He is so-called assimilated into the English literary and cultural world, but even in that world, he's seen as a Caribbean writer. So this produces a state of limbo that can be seen articulated in different ways in the work of many other writers. The other writers that Gikandi discusses are Sam Selwyn, most famous for the book The Lonely Londoners, Alejo Carpentier, and Polly Marshall, and of course Michelle Cliff as well. Gikandi focuses on Cliff's first Claire Savage novel, that is A Bang, and not the second Claire Savage novel, that is No Telephone to Heaven. Gikandi makes some very powerful observations about how one can go about addressing what is clearly a great historical and cultural omission. The omission consists in the fact that for the longest time, Anglophone novels from the Caribbean were seen as merely representing an area, and they were filling in the gaps of the European modernist novel with more evidence from the local peripheries. To explain what this statement means, Gikandi writes that there is a way of reading novels from the Caribbean which works with this phenomena that Gikandi calls the algebra of resemblance. So scholars can find features in Caribbean novels which seem to resemble features from the most canonized English or European modernist novels. Now, one way of doing this is to compare, let's say, for instance, a novel like Mrs. Dalloway with a novel like No Telephone to Heaven. Now, this comparative approach, which Gikandi calls the algebra of resemblance, would actually yield a lot of very good observations. Observations like how both of these novels focus on a single female protagonists who are also sometimes narrators. And they feature both as protagonists and narrators because the novelist uses a combination of the first person as well as the free indirect discourse, which is also known as the stream of consciousness. So Michelle Cliff can be read as Caribbean practitioner of what Virginia Woolf first innovated and demonstrated as an Anglophone modernist novelistic technique. This, for Gikandi, would be not a very good approach because it would miss the many ways in which the Caribbean novel does not simply reproduce or illustrate what the English modernist novel is doing, but rather actively challenges what the English modernist novel was doing. Gikandi's phrase or term for this is marronage. Marronage itself is a term that Gikandi borrows from Edward Glisson. Marronage for Glisson is a way of describing both the confinement as well as the rebellion and the liberation of black workers, indentured laborers, and slaves who, beginning in the 18th century, began to rebel, began to fight, began to take arms against their white captors. And the word Marona describes the sensibility and the culture as well as the literary texts that evolved from this experience of slave rebellions and the civilization that followed after the rebellion. So, a few black slaves broke away from captivity in the Caribbean, broke away from the plantations, and began to establish alternative civilizations outside slavery in the Caribbean. These were called Maroons. Now, for Gikandi, the Caribbean Anglophone novel is an act of marronage. Writers like Michelle Cliff are actively breaking free of what the English novel, in its acceptance of some key features of modernism and modernity, had established. There are some very obvious ways in which the English modernist novel celebrated and accepted the innovations in perception, space time continuum, innovations in classical music, innovations in visual technologies like photography and film. And all of these techniques turned into the style or the cinematic or the visual narrative of the modernist novel. One can easily see how novels by Virginia Woolf are quite cinematic, or at least, if not cinematic, at least quite visual in the way they accept and incorporate what technologies like the camera had made possible. So there are ways in which we can see the English novel as a modernist acceptance in the cultural realm of what modernity had established in the political, economic, and material realm. Now, Michelle Cliff's work as a Caribbean novelist can be seen as in an oppositional relationship to both modernism and modernity. It is oppositional to modernity most obviously because characters and events in the novel very powerfully challenge the legacies of slavery and colonial modernity, the establishment of the culture and the civilization that was made possible by the plantation life. In terms of its opposition to modernism, one can see how even the so-called closures of the modernist novel are denied in this post-colonial Caribbean modernist novel. So this is an important point that the Anglophone Caribbean novel can be seen as an exercise of marronage. This brings me to transition to the next novel and novelist in the series, which is A.S. Byatt, the writer, and the novel Possession, subtitled Romance. Now, the key theme that I want to explain is the meaning and the value of intertextual dialogue, which can be traced within the theme and the form of a late 20th century Anglophone novel, and what it means for a woman writer to practice such a form. So, there are many ways of approaching intertextuality. The most common approach from a literary historical point of view is to take the postmodernist approach. Now, there were several novels in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s which exercised a metatextual freedom in which the narrator began to describe the act of writing the novel and very frequently thematized the act of writing by describing writers struggling to produce fiction. So, novels about novels or fiction about fiction can be taken to be a very simple definition of metafiction. And metafiction was an important thematic trope in a lot of postmodernist novels. Postmodernism, philosophically speaking, was growing disenchantment with theories of or grand narratives of history. As Francois Lyotard puts it, postmodernism emerges from the failure of the promise of the 1960s, and specifically histories of communism, histories of the socialist upheavals that were promised by the Communist Manifesto. It seemed that most ideas of Marxist and socialist history, which involved the workers uniting and overthrowing the corrupt collusions of wealthy corporations and democratically elected governments, would produce a more equitable world. Those promises were broken, it seemed, and all over the world, workers' rebellions, workers' strikes failed. And so the 1970s seemed to produce this vacuum and this great alienation in which writers began to tell stories that were completely disconnected from events that were unfolding in the world. Or at least a lot of postmodernist novels began to take liberties with historical facts. They began to write contra-historical and counterfactual narratives. So speculative fiction as it is understood today, may be said to be in some ways inaugurated or enabled by what was happening in the 1960s, novels that took liberties with what was known about the historical past. In the British literary space, a novel that made this possible, a novel which took liberties with historical past and told stories that combined multiple temporal modes in the narration, and which enjoyed a great deal of success, and which is today also studied and taught in many classrooms all over the world, is the novel The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. Now, this is a novel that is set in the 20th century, but it also involves another story set in Victorian England. It's a story that involves two sets of characters, and sometimes one character who travels between these two worlds. So the first is 20th century England, and the second is Victorian England. And often one character is shuttling between these two. This is a trope that has today been popularized as a part of the historical fantasy genre of very popular novels. And those who are familiar with the Outlander series will know exactly what I'm talking about. Claire Randall, the protagonist, is a character who's inspired directly and whose creator, it can be said, must be inspired directly by John Fowles's writerly practices. Claire Randall is a character who visits the world of the Jacobite rebellion, which Walter Scott first made popular in his early 19th century novel Waverley. But that novelistic world and that historical world is created as a sort of fantasy world, as a fantasy into which Claire Randall disappears almost by accident in the beginning, but later on is drawn into that world. Claire Randall is drawn into that world from post-World War II Scotland into this 18th century Scottish rebellion because of her attraction to a character or a man in that earlier world. So Claire Randall is a figure who's possessed both by history as well as by her attraction to a man. And I use the word possessed, and I use this transition to segue into talking about A.S. Byatt's novel Possession, because it is also subtitled A Romance. Now, just to give a little bit of background, and then I'll explain what I mean by possession here. This is an academic novel. It can be said to be a part of this tradition of campus novels as well, because it features two young researchers. They are early career academics. They are struggling to make their careers as scholars, and they are looking for good historical material. And one of them is working as a research assistant for a senior professor who's writing about a Victorian poet. Now, in his supervisor's notes, this young junior faculty member, finds a letter written by one Victorian poet to an unknown lover, friend, or in some ways an intimate partner. This piques the curiosity of our first protagonist, who goes down this rabbit hole and unleashes this whole new world of both Victorian poets, but also late 20th century academics and researchers who are chasing these fantasies. So the novel becomes sort of shuttling between two worlds. One is late 20th century England, where two researchers, a man and a woman, follow a breadcrumb trail into the archives of 19th century poetry. They discover a story of intrigue, of love, of abandonment, of secret pregnancies, of illicit childbirths, of children abandoned, and a woman discovering her sexuality, a woman experimenting with her sexuality, a woman finding the courage to own her sexuality as a lesbian, and the many narratives that exist around it, her abandoned and aborted affairs with another male poet, the child that she bears from that relationship. All of this historical but also suppressed information is unearthed as these two researchers embark on this journey. So there are two possessions and there are two romances. The first is between these two academics who discover the writings of these two Victorian poets in a library in London. The second is the world that they discover through the letters of these Victorian poets. So these two narratives unfold on parallel tracks until the novel ends in a very violent conclusion, which doesn't so much offer a historical closure as it does offer a very sensational closure to a novel. So this is a very ambitious novel. It's full of historical as well as literary historical information, and it emerges from A.S. Byatt's career as an academic. So just before Byatt began writing this novel, she gave up her job as a senior lecturer in English at University College London and decided to devote herself full-time to the writing of fiction. Byatt's career as a PhD in English and as a lecturer at University College London was also severely constrained by many of the gendered assumptions and many of the misogynist rules that seem to be accepted as a part of normal functioning by academia. So, for instance, A.S. Byatt lost her scholarship, which she was using to support herself as a PhD scholar, when she got married to another academic. And this is ironic because for male academics, the rule was different. For male academics, if they got married, the fellowship or the scholarship amount was increased because because they were seen as the providers. But in the case of A.S. Byatt, she actually lost her fellowship. So this is a novel that's very deeply informed by the gender politics of professional literary studies. What does it mean to devote one's life to a study of literature? What does it mean to devote one's life to reading, to understanding the past? And how does one continue to do that in a world that is very hostile towards women? In a way, possession, a romance, is an answer to this question. Because A.S. Byatt gave up her job as a professional academic, but it can be argued that she continued to do her job as an academic. In fact, continued to execute her responsibilities towards her professional community in a much more powerful way and in a much more exemplary way after resigning from her position as an academic. So this is a novel that tells a story not just about human beings and about the motivations, the desires, the risks, the pain, and the ambitions of human beings, but also a story about how institutions treat the lives and the pasts of human beings. So these academics, they are trying to add something to what the professional body knows about Victorian poetry. The woman poet, the letter to whom is discovered, is clearly someone the literary and professional establishment does not want to know. Her existence has to be imagined into being. Her past has to be almost willed into being. So there is a sense in which these two academics, these two junior faculty members, are actually possessed by the ghost of this forgotten Victorian woman lesbian poet. They're also possessed by a desire to make their profession much more equitable. But more than that, they are possessed by a desire to make their own careers. And this possession leads them into a lot of different kinds of entanglements, into a lot of conflicts. The novel Possession sheds very important light on what are the feminist underpinnings of romance as a tradition. Now, romance as a tradition typically has had some very misogynist underpinnings. It tends to work with this assumption of women as essentially weak and in need of completion or in need of support from a stable provider type of figure. In this context, this novel challenges these assumptions by stating that male researchers, male faculty members can be possessed, can be intoxicated, can lose their sense of judgment, rationality, etc., just as a lot of women protagonists in the lesser form of romance novels were possessed. I will continue this discussion of the gendered underpinnings of romance and intoxication in the next lecture. Thank you.